Even after Joseph McCarthy fades into political obscurity after critique of his tactics for being too harsh, there is still a climate of fear perpetuated by the fact that these investigations against suspected communists were not only happening at the National Congress, but also at the state level. State legislatures had their own HUACs, or House Un-American Activity Committees, and states passed laws designed to ferret out communists. Laws like mandating loyalty oaths and prohibiting communists from being able to do things like obtain a driver's license. Although I don't know that anybody, when asked if they were a communist and told they couldn't get their license, if they said yes, would actually say yes. Loyalty oaths are not just required by state governments, but also by businesses and private organizations as a condition of membership, to take an oath of loyalty to the United States and to deny that you had ever been or ever expressed sympathy with ever been involved in or expressed sympathy for the Communist Party. Even past participation in an activity remotely associated with communism could taint a person. So we call this guilt by association. For example, some Americans had traveled to Spain in the 1930s to fight against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, to fight against General Francisco Franco, who was a fascist. And this even was looked at as being potentially communist because communists had fought against Franco. So even though we had fought fascism in World War II, because all of the Axis powers were fascists, these people who had gone to Spain and fought against fascists in Spain were accused of being communist. Even books that seemed relatively innocent could be seen as promoting communism. For example, Robin Hood, right, stealing from the rich to give to the poor, was dubbed a communist, and books like Robin Hood were actually banned from public schools and libraries. What also contributed to this climate of fear was the lack of support from the court system, which ignored basic requirements. The Supreme Court in 1951, in the case Dennis versus the United States, argued that it was entirely legal to imprison people purely on the basis of their beliefs and not on the basis of any actions on their part, which is a flagrant violation of US law. Most people who were labeled as communists, fired from their jobs, jailed, were not in fact communists, but people who happened to hold unpopular political ideas. One of the relatively new agencies tasked with looking for communists at home was the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which, like the CIA, was a relatively young agency of the federal government. The FBI was led by a man named J. Edgar Hoover, who was its first and very long-standing director. J. Edgar Hoover had gotten his start as a young man in federal law enforcement after World War I, most famously heading up the Radicals division within the Justice Department and participating in raids against suspected left-leaning organizations in 1919 and 1920, the so-called Palmer raids. Hoover, during his tenure as director of the FBI, kept files on thousands of people, even those not explicitly connected to communism, but just on the suspicion that they could be or that they had connections. Now, during this time in politics, there is a bit of a quandary. Republicans frequently painted Democrats, because they had a little bit more left-leaning social policies than Republicans, as communist sympathizers. And in fact, one of the reasons that Joseph McCarthy was successful for so long in engaging in his bullying tactics within the HUAC hearings was because if people spoke up criticizing McCarthy, they were often targeted and accused as well of being communists or sympathizing with communists. The other thing that Democrats oftentimes faced accusations of was that they had previously worked with the Communist Party in the 1930s during the New Deal era, at a time when the Communist Party in the United States was still seen as more radical, but was not targeted to the same extent as it was during this time period. So, for many politicians, both Republicans and Democrats, they found it necessary for their political survival to be as virulently anti communist as possible to survive any challenges or accusations of being soft on communism. In particular, Congress passes a series of laws designed to go after communism. The McCarran Internal Security Bill in 1950 is actually vetoed by President Truman. However, Congress overrides the veto. The McCarran Internal Security Bill gives Congress the right to require subversive groups to register with their government. It gave Congress the power to restrict passports to suspected subversives, and it gave the president the power to deport anyone who was seen as being a subversive. Similarly, the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952 was also passed over President Truman's veto, and this was about the question of immigration. Should we reform the immigration system to allow for more refugees from communist states to come into the United States? The McCarran-Walter Act says no. The McCarran-Walter Act says we're going to continue abiding by the quota system of immigration from the 1920s. There will be no adjustment to allow for political refugees. And they also declare that the government had the right to deport communists, even communists who had gone through the citizenship process and were now naturalized US citizens. So, if you're sensing an anti immigrant strain, you would not be wrong. In a similar vein, in 1954, federal law enforcement launches what they call Operation Wetback, which were raids in Mexican neighborhoods targeting Mexicans who had been in the nation illegally. And they deported about 1 million Mexicans in these raids in 1954. So, the effect of all of this anti communism on unions in particular is very hard. Many unions had been associated with more leftist politics, with communist leaning members being among the most effective organizers in unions. But faced with the changing political climate, many unions moved to, again, distance themselves from radicalism and expel communist leaning workers from their ranks. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, actually kicks out about 1 million members for being suspected communists. Now, once communists are kicked out of the unions, not only do the unions lose some of their most effective organizers, but they also lose people who had been the biggest supporters for racial and gender equality within these unions. And this becomes a bit of a crisis point for unions as they're facing rapid decline in the next decade due to the process of deindustrialization, which we'll talk about in a future section. And unions are one of many organizations like Hollywood, as we talked about, who have to try to distance themselves as much as possible from the taint of communism. Anti-communism even creeps into America's religious communities. Communism was depicted as godless because, according to communism, religion was the opiate of the masses. So, in other words, religion was used as a tool of control to keep the working class and the proletariat in thrall to the capitalist overlords. So, communism was at most neutral, secular. However, communism could also be depicted as anti God, as many Americans depicted throughout the 1950s, expressing particular concern that communism was present in deeply Catholic regions like Eastern Europe, fearing for the religious freedom and the right to practice of Catholic Christians. In 1957, to again kind of counter the perception of communism as godless and thus we are good religious folks in the United States adds "In God We Trust" to American currency. And for the first time, the Pledge of Allegiance adds in the phrase "under God" as well, to further promote this difference between us and the Soviet Union. There's also this tendency to emphasize the shared commonalities in Judeo-Christian religion, particularly talking about how much Jews, Catholics, and Protestants have in common, which somewhat erases the long history of antagonism and conflict between these three religious groups. Nevertheless, there is this emphasis of commonly held values across these religions, and this is part of the reason why Hollywood develops this obsession in the late 50s and early 60s with what we call sword and sandals pics. So, biblical themed films, like, for example, uh, I'm blanking on the names now, the Ten Commandments, uh, Ben Hur, and others. And if you're interested in finding a little bit of political satire about this, the Coen brothers film Hail Caesar actually has a great scene in which they're talking about making a film. So in the film, they're making a film about the death of Jesus and the conversion of this Roman soldier who's played by George Clooney. And they actually have a scene in the film where they bring in, this is going to sound like the beginning of a bad joke, they bring in a rabbi, a Catholic priest, a Protestant pastor, a Greek Orthodox priest, to all talk about the depiction of Jesus on film, how the studio can do it tastefully, and it ends up devolving to a discussion of the divinity or not of Christ. So it's a really interesting scene. I suggest you check it out. There's also a concern over the taint of communism among civil rights organizations, because many of civil rights movements had in the 1930s and 1940s welcomed organizing help from the American Communist Party. And now, much like labor unions, civil rights organizations face the prospect of their more radical members tainting the whole movement. And so, like the CIO, the NAACP, one of the leading activist organizations in the African American community, will eject communist members in an attempt to try to minimize their association with communists. This is going to lead to an interesting split in the movement. So, when we talk about the history of the civil rights movement, many people think about the 1950s and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and the "I Have a Dream" speech, right? And so the conversation about the civil rights movement, the narrative, if you start it there, goes, well, we have all of these very religious people leading the movement in the South and advocating for nonviolence. And then eventually we'll get to northern cities, and then they start talking about things like economic inequality and social inequality. And then there are riots, and then there are, Black Panthers and Black Power and all these radical Black people walking around. And it makes it seem like the civil rights movement, it goes through two very different phases. But if you look at the civil rights movement as a longer movement and you focus on it from, say, the early 1900s or maybe World War I, and you go forward, you'll find that this presence of radical activists is a much longer part of civil rights movement history. They don't just spontaneously pop up in inner cities in the 1960s. They're just temporarily shoved out of the picture in the 1950s because of the expansion of communism and anti-communism. So the United States, as we are moving into the mid-1950s, faces an important question. Do we allow dissent? Because, as Murrow pointed out, many Americans were confusing dissent with disloyalty and arguing that anybody who criticized folks like Joseph McCarthy for their methods, or who questioned why we should put people in jail just because they said they were communists and hadn't actually done any spying or espionage, anytime you spoke out like that, you risked being labeled unpatriotic, disloyal, un-American. So for many Americans, they quickly figured out that it was far safer for them to conform to the social norm, to be openly very anti-communist, to keep any critique of the government or anti-communist crusade by the government to themselves, and to otherwise try to live their lives in as conventional a way as possible to avoid attracting attention or accusation or suspicions for being communist. So in the 1950s is very frequently framed as a decade of conformity, largely because of this paranoia of being labeled as different and facing a very real prospect of losing your livelihood and your friends and potentially your freedom for being accused of being a communist. It's not really going to be until the 1960s that dissent becomes full mainstream, but as we'll talk about as we get further into our discussion of the 50s, dissent is there in the 1950s. You just need to know where to look for it. Until next time, I'm Dr. Esmacher.